You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host, and I'm going to be taking and continuing a further deep dive into the whole issue of ADHD, mainly because this is in the social media and the general media become a hot item. And it's interesting if we take a bigger picture look at what's going on with people's mental health. It seems to me, and I think some others have made this observation as well, that it appears that at no other time in recent history have we become so psychologically and psychiatrically unwell. Okay, we suffer from psychological distress, we suffer from psychological disorders. The rate and frequency of these issues seem to have exploded. People appear to be banging at the door of help, for help, and are struggling to get it. So you've got to ask the question that why at this point, at this particular time in history, when we've actually got more psychopharmacology available to us than ever before, is it just continuing to get worse? So in part, I'm choosing to use ADD as an example of the need for a much, much more critical look at human psychology and behavior in its context. You know, if we've got this degree of psychological distress and so many psychological disorders popping out of the woodwork, as it were, then is it reasonable to assume that this is just all genetic, it's in our genes? Well, obviously not, because this is not how human beings necessarily have functioned, expressed themselves for a large part of our evolutionary history. So it begs a lot of questions in this context. And, again, we have become extraordinarily quick to come up with the sort of magic bomb, the sort of magic bullet to deal with, any form of, illness, psychological distress, psychological disorder. I'll give you a case that's not about the psychology of human beings, but rather is about weight loss. The absolute market hit of Ozempic is a really interesting issue from the perspective of here's a drug that does what it says it does, but it also appears to have a significant cost to the user. Now, I'm not going to get into detail with that because that's not what I'm here for. It's also really outside of my area of expertise. Although I could argue that we could use some of the information and critical thinking to develop better knowledge about this and therefore affect a wiser use of that medication and medications in general. And this is what I want everybody to really critically think about it. If we are going to put children and now adults on these types of medication, we really want to understand what the long-term impact of that is. Now, again, I'm going to argue that best practice generally in my field is that we use counselling, behavioural strategies, psychotherapy as the front end. And then if we need to support it with medication. Unfortunately, that's not what I see in clinical practice. Most people who come to see me, the boys, teenage boys and men, are already on a host of medication when I get to see them, and I'm trying to assess them. And unfortunately, that has an impact on my capacity to actually do what's called a solid sound differential diagnosis. And it leads itself to certain biases in clinical practice that I, as both a philosopher and someone interested in anthropology, especially psychological and biological anthropology, I'm really tempted to ask, and that is my diagnosis being affected by culture, by other people's perceptions, by my own, subconscious underlying cognitive biases, and someone else's cognitive bias? Okay, so in this episode, I want to focus on, the sort of studies that have been put forward to support ADD. And there's a number of, areas that, has begun to study this more and more and more over the years, okay? So the top one on the hit parade is neuroimaging studies. And the method basically there is that researchers use neuroimaging techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRIs, positron emission tomography, they are PET scans, or single photon emission computed tomography, which is SPECT, to visualize brain activity and assess neurotransmitter function. These studies often involve comparing brain activity between individuals with the condition of interest, i.e. ADD, and in this case the summary says or anxiety, and supposedly healthy controls. So the argument is that neuroimaging can help identify brain regions that are associated with transmitter activity and investigate how differences in neurotransmitter function may relate to symptoms. Now, what I want everybody to remember, please, is that this particular area is fundamentally based on a reductionist scientific method. Okay, we're going to go down to the little nitty-gritty and then see, what we find. Unfortunately, it's a bit like me asking you the question of H2O is the sort of chemical symbol for water. Which bit makes it wet? Okay, now it might sound silly, but this is fundamentally important in the questions that we're asking. The next big hit is pharmacological. Okay. And so in this particular method, we're looking at controlled laboratory settings where researchers administer drugs that selectively affect specific neurotransmitter systems, dopamine and serotonin particularly, to the participants with the condition that's being studied. Then we look at changes in symptoms or behaviour that are then observed and measured. I've got a special announcement about how you can work with me. Since starting this podcast, I've had a lot of inquiries from listeners asking how they can work with me on a one-to-one basis. Now, I've finally managed to free up some time to work with about 5 clients privately. Typically, we'll work together for 6 months, applying the ideas I discuss here to help you lead a fulfilled, meaningful, and happy life, and a well-rounded life. If that's something you'd be interested in, drop me an email at gunter@goodmengreat.com and we'll be in touch. Now, we've already got some clear issues coming out. Now, I'm going to go through these approaches, and then either in this episode I'm going to introduce some of the critiques of these methodologies, and or do the next episode, the next podcast, on really diving deep in the critique of the approaches. Okay? So fundamentally the idea is that this method, this pharmacological research methodology, helps researchers understand how alterations in neurotransmitter levels influence behaviour and symptom expression. It can also provide insight, at least that's what they say, into potential treatment options. Okay, now let me flick into the use of antidepressants. And the largest school of antidepressants are SSRIs and SNRIs. And again, they're based fundamentally on the theory that depression comes about because of an issue with the reuptake of serotonin into the brain. Okay? Now, interestingly enough, there's been a huge amount of critique of this theory, which has struggled, in fact, to get any sort of traction, both in research or clinical practice, despite the problems, and has continued to fuel a massive level of prescription rates in the population. And fundamentally, unfortunately, because of the pressures on doctors and to some degree the system, when someone presents in distress, it is relatively straightforward to offer them a prescription without necessarily going, hang on, let's take a step back, let's examine this a little bit more closely. And I'm open to being challenged on this, by all means. However, unlike some psychiatrists, to me, depression or ADD is fundamentally not an illness. I do see schizophrenia as an illness, but not depression, nor anxiety, nor ADD. So the other area that's been very highly utilised is the genetic and molecular studies that have been conducted over time. Essentially, genetic studies examine how variations in specific genes relate to neurotransmitter function that may be associated with a higher risk of developing conditions like ADD or anxiety. Molecular studies assess neurotransmitter levels or receptor activity in biological samples, such as blood or cerebral spinal fluid. Again, we have the same problem. Reductionism is a particular issue here. We know from lots and lots of studies that genetics don't necessarily explain a great deal. We need to then take a step into epigenetics. And if everybody's interested in this, I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. Although, again, my background in this comes from the philosophy of science and biology, as well as anthropology in that area. But I'll do my best to get into it and make it, accessible to the average person in the street. Because, again, we're asked to make decisions, and when it comes to accepting treatment, it's all about an informed consent, which in a lot of instances mean you know what you're signing up for, but that's not necessarily the case. Whether that be pain medication, whether it be mood-altering drugs, where it may be, things like cortisone, you can't, as an individual, be expected to have this whole body of knowledge up your sleeve. So we are reliant on the people who are experts in this field to be able to, give us a really good background. Okay, so let's go to the next one, which is neuropsychological assessments. Now, this is really falling into the area of psychology solidly. And what researchers do there is they use neuropsychological tests and assessments to measure cognitive functions. So, for example, attention, executive functions, so associated to the frontal lobe, that are then associated with specific neurotransmitter systems. Now, that is a real stretch in terms of explanation. Because all I can go on is what the test actually gives me, and it's not testing neurotransmitter systems. Okay, so we can infer and we can come to conclusions about where the cognitive deficits are and why they might be the case. But all of that, again, is theory dependent. So depending on the theory that you sort of bought into will explain to a certain degree your explanation of the problem. Okay? Now, the one that I find really cute is animal studies. So in animal studies, which are often conducted in rodents that involve manipulating neurotransmitter systems through genetic modification or drug administrations, we then watch their behaviour and we, get some data from it. So the researcher really then just observes how these manipulations impact behaviour. So it doesn't give us any insight into the internal experience of the animal. We're not quite there yet with AI to, translate animal language. And I'll say that with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, although there's some potential there. Thinking about an article that I read recently on work being done to use AI to decipher whale calls. Cetaceans in a broader sense. And I'm particularly interested in that because for the life of me, I'd love to know what they're chatting about. Again, there's got to be some really critical thinking applied to this particular area and the way that the studies are used. Now, finally, well, maybe not finally, but, the biggie is the longitudinal and observational studies that go across time. And unfortunately, to be honest, we don't necessarily have a whole lot of good ones because they're expensive. So essentially what the proposition is that a longitudinal study follows the individual with ADHD or anxiety over an extended period, collecting data at multiple time points. Observational studies involve observing individuals in their natural environments, a bit like ethnographic research in anthropology, right? But my anthropological friends might argue about how that's done. So the pitch is that these studies help researchers track the development and progression of symptoms and can provide information about how neurotransmitters function may change over time. Oh, okay. Now, in some ways, from a clinical perspective, the question is, what is the problem? What's the progression of the problem? And what can we do, to alleviate the problem, now in inverted commas, because it may not be a problem at all. You see, this also now comes into play. How do I define when something is a problem? And people will go, well, I've got this head that doesn't shut up. All my thoughts, it's a bit like 50 railway tracks coming into two, and I'm trying to make a decision about what I'm thinking, and I'm impulsive. I'm really quick to decide on doing something and then discover that's not the right thing to do. But it's broader, it's bigger than that, okay? And finally, this is finally in terms of methodologies, we have the issue of meta-analyses and systematic reviews. Okay, and basically, this is where, as researchers, we conduct comprehensive reviews of existing studies and we systematically analyse published research to synthesise findings from multiple studies. And the idea is that it helps us to establish consensus findings and identify trends or patterns in the existing literature. Very, very useful in many respects. But again, one of the biggest issues that I'm going to highlight now as we're coming towards the end of this particular episode, and I'm really hoping that you guys out there are finding this interesting, because if you are thinking about, one, what your problem is, secondly, how you're going to deal with it, I want everybody out there to be thinking about this from a very critical perspective. And it's important because this can have some far-reaching consequences, both physiologically but also psychologically, and then in your relationships. It does. It bears thinking about. So if we go back to the original proposition that we start with data that we change into information that creates knowledge from which we utilize wisdom, right? That jump between knowledge and wisdom is a really complex one. And as I said, in medicine and psychiatry and in psychology, the very critical aspect of informed consent makes a difference. We need to ask questions. We need to be critical. There's nothing wrong in getting a second opinion, even if it might piss your clinician off. If that's the case, they need to pocket their ego. I'd want to know why there are different points of view. And, having, surrendered myself into the surgical environment, I was very clear with the people that I was talking to about the ins and outs of this and what they were proposing and how they were proposing to do it and what it meant for me in the short, medium and long term. And I mean, the surgery, which was fundamentally replacing 2 shoulder joints with prosthesis, seems to be a no-brainer, right? My shoulders were stuffed. We'll replace them with these mechanisms and then you'll be as good as rain. Again, not as straightforward, but, I trusted the surgeon that I was seeing to have the best possible knowledge base, and he was great because he treated the whole thing as like teamwork. I'm going to give you what I know, and I'm going to help you to try and make the best possible decision that you can. Ultimately, however, it is your decision. And it worked brilliantly, and I mean, I've referred lots and lots of people to him because he has a great bedside manner. He makes sure that there is informed consent, and technically he's brilliant in what he does. The outcome, the results, couldn't ask for better. It's my own body which had kicked in a couple of curveballs, but that's okay. This is, it's not just science, technology. Surgery, to a large degree, is an art that is dependent on what my body does with that intervention to a large degree. Okay, so having said that, some people might go, well, this is sort of a bit boring, but it's not. If you really dig into it, this is not boring. This is fundamental stuff that we need to think about in our lives, especially as with technology and pharmacology and so on, it gets bigger and better and more complicated. Remember the example of Ozempic. And there's a whole host of others. If I go back into the 50s, thalidomide was a problem. Now, I'm hoping that we've gotten smart enough not to repeat these problems. Okay, I hope this is stimulating you guys into some really critical thinking and maybe, just maybe, getting into, inspiring some change out about how you approach your own life, your own issues, and how you seek help, assistance, and not just swallow whatever is served up in social media. So, if you want to know any more about my work, please go to www.goodmengreat.com or www.gunterswoboda.com. And until next time, this is me signing off, and I hope that you're going to continue joining me on this really interesting topic, because in the next session, I'm going to talk about some deep critical issues around this, and then I'm going to wrap it, and then we're going to follow on with some other exciting topics from here on in. Also planning some 50-minute podcasts with some very, very interesting people. One of them is conversations with my wife. We've got a really interesting 50-minute show planned out, and some really, really interesting people coming up soon. Until next time, this is me signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.gunterswoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.